spring 1982. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had been in power for nearly 3 years. An economic recession and high unemployment had split the party and the country, and her domestic rating was at its lowest. But then an unexpected and distant war saw her popularity soar. Victory in the Falklands transformed Mrs. Thatcher's flagging fortune. It sealed her reputation as the Iron Lady. In time, it would secure her a second term in office. But why did Britain fight to save the fate of a sparsely populated and far-flung protectorate? The Falklands lie 300 miles east of the Argentine coast. Britain had occupied and administered the island since 1833 and had consistently rejected all claims to sovereignty by Argentina. But by 1966, this anomalous possession became the subject for successive British governments to explore if, with the right conditions attached, a different status could be negotiated.
It was quite obvious at that time that the Argentinians were getting rather impatient. We came up with the idea of the leaseback. But of course, the problem with the leaseback was, first of all, that the right wing of the Conservative Party felt outraged that any bit of British territory should be ceded, even if there was a 200-year leaseback. And the Labour Party, the left wing of the Labour Party, they were outraged that you should cede any British territory to a right-wing dictator. And the sensible people in the middle didn't make any noise at all. And so you were left at that time with nothing to negotiate with.
With progress stalled, the Falklands issue slipped down the political agenda. And although by early 1982 General Galtieri was making increasingly bellicose noises regarding reclaiming the Malvinas, and there had been 2 incursions into South Georgia, the response of the British government was limited.
We'd obviously discussed the Falklands. We discussed the antics of that group that went down to South Georgia, allegedly to collect scrap. But none of us seriously thought that the Argentinians would invade. That was, to the best of my recollection, that was never really on the agenda. We thought there might be a blockading or a tightening up, but I don't recall people saying the Argentinians are going to invade.
So when on Friday the 2nd of April 1982 Argentina did invade the Falklands, it caught most people by surprise. But with hindsight, almost everyone could point to the warning signs.
People felt that probably we didn't react as fast and firmly. I'm not sure what we could do, because South Georgia is about 800 miles out from the Falklands. But I think there was a feeling that we hadn't reacted as violently as we ought to have done when Steptoe and Son from Latin America landed on South Georgia and started dismantling the whaling station. They came back again too. And so my problem was that people were prepared to lay the charge at me in lobby briefings that you brought it on yourself.
The government too had been given specific warning of an invasion only 2 days earlier.
The Ministry of Defence view, as retailed by John Knott, was that before it, if they are taken, then they cannot be recovered. Well, Mrs. Thatcher wondered what kind of Ministry of Defence they got. I mean, she was pretty grumpy about that. That's no way to start a problem, is it? And then, after the invasion had occurred, Admiral Leach, I think he was Chief of the Naval Staff, was summoned to a meeting in her room at the house. He couldn't find it. He was in mufti, so he was briefly detained by the authorities. But when a whip got him to Margaret Thatcher's room, she said, well, what can you do? I can assemble a task force in 48 hours. Well, you know, it's not the best start to recovering the Falklands to have a Minister of Defence saying you can't, and the Chief of the Naval Staff saying, I'm going to send a task force. I mean, really, it was comic. You could argue that it's pretty comic, actually, tragicomedy.
So, just 3 days after the invasion, on the 5th of April, a task force set sail for the South Atlantic. Parliament had been informed of the plan during an emergency session 2 days before. It was a difficult time for Mrs. Thatcher, but if she feared arguing the case for action in the Commons, she was mistaken. MPs of all parties were outraged, and the House was almost unanimous in backing the government.
The most stirring speech, call to arms, literally, against Galtieri and his fascist government, was made by Michael Foot. It was clear from the first minutes that the Labour Party would be relentless in its opposition to Galtieri and to the invasion.
As Mrs. Thatcher would later recall in her memoirs, her announcement of the task force being ready to sail was greeted with growls of approval.
The atmosphere was indescribable. I mean, the tension, the electricity, the shame, if you like, that it had occurred, the anger, especially, I think, from opposition benches, absolute anger that this had occurred, and yet a determination, as evinced by Michael Foot, that we've got to get him off.
On the same day the task force set sail, the Foreign Secretary resigned.
I didn't anticipate at that time that there was going to be an invasion, because all the intelligence that I was getting was that the Argentinians wouldn't do anything until they'd been to the United Nations and exhausted all the procedures there. And of course that was wrong. I mean, I don't particularly blame the intelligence people, because I mean, how you know, people's intentions, how do you gauge that? Perhaps there is a moral that which could be perhaps thought of in current circumstances, that you shouldn't rely too much on intelligence.
The speed at which the task force had been assembled was astounding. Extensive television coverage of its departure from Portsmouth gave the impression both of military strength and a proud nation prepared to fight to regain its lawful territory. But military action in difficult conditions 8,000 miles from home had to be a last option. Mrs. Thatcher knew diplomacy must come first.
Margaret Thatcher had a very ambivalent attitude to the Foreign Office. As an institution, she was immensely suspicious of it. She thought, I've always felt she was a little harsh on them, that diplomacy was a sort of form of appeasement. You know, that the question, you were looking for a way around a problem, and you might have to surrender something to get what you wanted. So she was always suspicious of the institution, but she admired individuals. And one of the people she admired particularly was Tony Parsons at the UN, who contrived to get UN support for a resolution which became almost the basis of our future action.
Next began a long and tiring round of shuttle diplomacy by US Secretary of State Al Haig.